Modern life has made emotional regulation significantly more difficult than it was for previous generations. We're constantly bombarded with notifications, news, social media updates, and high-pressure demands that keep our nervous systems in a heightened state of alertness. When the nervous system is already dysregulated from chronic low-level stress, even small emotional triggers can feel disproportionately overwhelming. Ancient traditions understood that emotions are not the enemy, but when the body is already in survival mode, the capacity to process feelings healthily diminishes dramatically. In this chapter, we explore why emotions feel so intense today and what has changed in our environment that makes regulation harder than ever before. Understanding this context is the first step toward developing a more compassionate and effective relationship with our emotional world. The speed and volume of modern life create a perfect storm for emotional overwhelm. We wake up to news alerts, scroll through curated highlight reels of other people's lives, answer work messages before we've even had breakfast, and carry a constant low-grade anxiety about being behind or not doing enough. This constant stimulation keeps the sympathetic nervous system activated, which narrows our window of tolerance for emotional experiences. When we operate from this activated state, emotions that might have felt manageable in a calmer nervous system state now feel threatening or all-consuming. Ancient wisdom traditions understood that emotional steadiness requires a certain level of internal safety and spaciousness. Without that foundation, emotions become difficult to navigate because the body interprets them as additional threats rather than normal human experiences. This is why so many people today report feeling emotionally exhausted, even when their external circumstances are relatively stable. The nervous system is simply carrying too much activation with too little recovery. Another major factor is the loss of emotional containment that existed in previous generations. In many traditional cultures, there were clear rituals, community structures, and daily rhythms that helped people process emotions collectively and individually. Today, many people process difficult emotions in isolation, often through screens, without the regulating presence of community or meaningful ritual. This isolation amplifies emotional intensity because the nervous system relies heavily on co-regulation with other calm nervous systems to return to baseline. When we lack consistent co-regulation, our emotional experiences can feel more raw and harder to integrate. Additionally, the modern emphasis on constant productivity and optimization has created a subtle cultural message that difficult emotions are problems to be solved or eliminated, rather than experiences to be felt and understood. This creates an internal conflict where part of us wants to feel our emotions, while another part judges ourselves for having them, which only increases the sense of overwhelm. The combination of chronic nervous system activation, social isolation, and cultural pressure to be emotionally fine has created a generation that feels emotionally fragile, even though human emotions themselves have not changed. What has changed is our capacity to be with them. Now, we will explore ancient and modern approaches to building that capacity, not by suppressing emotions or forcing positivity, but by developing a more regulated nervous system and a wiser relationship with our emotional world. This foundation makes emotional regulation feel less like an impossible task and more like a natural skill that can be developed over time. One of the most sophisticated contributions of ancient wisdom traditions is the distinction between feeling an emotion and being controlled by it. Many people today operate under the assumption that if they feel something strongly, they must act on it or be consumed by it. Ancient traditions, particularly Stoicism and Buddhism, offered a radically different perspective. Emotions can be fully felt without being given control over our actions or identity. This capacity is not about suppression or detachment in the cold sense. It is about developing enough internal space and regulation that emotions can move through us without hijacking our nervous system or decision-making. In this chapter, we explore how ancient traditions cultivated this skill and why it remains one of the most valuable capacities we can develop in modern life. The Stoics made a clear distinction between what they called impressions and judgments. An impression is the initial emotional reaction, the wave of anger, fear, or sadness that arises. A judgment is the story we add to that impression and the decision about how to respond. They taught that while we cannot always control the initial impression, we have significant power over the judgment we form and the action we take. This distinction is profoundly relevant to nervous system regulation.
When we immediately fuse with an emotion and treat it as an absolute truth that must be acted upon, we often escalate our nervous system activation. When we can create even a small gap between the feeling and our response, we give the nervous system time to settle and the thinking brain time to come back online. This gap is not about denying the emotion. It is about refusing to let the emotion make decisions on our behalf while we are still in a dysregulated state. Buddhist traditions approach this same capacity through the practice of mindfulness and the understanding of impermanence. Emotions were seen as mental events that arise and pass away, rather than as solid truths about reality or identity. The practice was not to push emotions away, but to observe them with enough clarity and steadiness that they did not automatically trigger reactive behavior. This required a regulated nervous system capable of staying present with intensity without becoming overwhelmed or shut down. Both Stoic and Buddhist approaches recognize that the ability to feel without being controlled by feelings is not a personality trait some people are born with. It is a skill developed through consistent practice, particularly practices that regulate the nervous system and cultivate inner stability. Without that foundation, attempts to not react often become suppression, which creates its own problems downstream. In modern life, this ancient capacity is more valuable than ever. We are constantly provoked by news, social media, work demands, and interpersonal conflicts that trigger strong emotional responses. The ability to feel the emotion fully while maintaining enough regulation to choose our response is what separates reactive living from wise living. This does not mean becoming emotionally numb or detached. It means developing enough internal space that emotions inform us without controlling us. Let's now explore specific practices and perspectives that help build this capacity, including how to work with difficult emotions without suppressing them, and how to build the kind of inner strength that allows us to stay steady even when emotions are intense.
Emotional resilience is often misunderstood as the ability to remain unaffected by difficult experiences. In reality, true emotional resilience is the capacity to be affected by life's challenges without losing our center or resorting to numbing behaviors. Many people in modern culture have developed impressive abilities to push through difficult emotions or distract themselves from them, but this often comes at the cost of genuine resilience. When we numb or suppress emotions, we may feel temporarily more functional, but we also reduce our nervous system's capacity to process and integrate emotional experiences over time. Ancient traditions understood that resilience is built not by avoiding or overriding emotions, but by developing the internal resources to stay present with them in a regulated way. In this chapter, we explore how to build genuine emotional resilience without falling into the trap of emotional numbing. One of the most important distinctions is between resilience and endurance. Endurance is the ability to keep going despite emotional pain, often by disconnecting from it. Resilience is the ability to recover and return to baseline more quickly after emotional challenges. These are very different capacities. Many high-achieving people in modern culture have developed significant endurance but surprisingly low resilience. They can push through emotional difficulty for long periods, but they struggle to actually process and recover from it. This often leads to eventual burnout or sudden emotional collapses when the accumulated unprocessed emotions finally become too much for the nervous system to contain. Ancient traditions recognize that true resilience requires both the capacity to stay present with difficulty and the capacity to release and recover afterward. This requires a nervous system that can move flexibly between activation and restoration rather than staying stuck in one state. Building resilience without numbing also requires developing tolerance for emotional discomfort. Many people have very low tolerance for certain emotions, particularly sadness, anger, shame, or fear, and will do almost anything to avoid feeling them fully. This low tolerance often comes from earlier experiences where those emotions were overwhelming or unsafe to express. Over time, the nervous system learns to shut down or distract whenever those feelings arise. Building resilience involves gently increasing our capacity to be with these emotions without immediately trying to change or escape them. This does not mean wallowing or indulging in difficult emotions. It means developing enough safety in the nervous system that we can feel them without being hijacked by them. Practices such as slow breathing, grounding, and compassionate self-talk can help create this safety while we learn to stay present with what we feel.
Another key aspect of building resilience is developing emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between different emotional states with precision. Many people have a very limited emotional vocabulary and tend to label most difficult feelings as anxiety or stress. This lack of precision makes it harder for the nervous system to respond appropriately because the body receives a vague, generalized signal of threat rather than a specific emotional message. Ancient traditions often had rich emotional vocabularies and practices for naming and differentiating inner states. Developing this capacity helps the nervous system process emotions more efficiently and reduces the sense of being vaguely overwhelmed. Let's now look into specific practices for increasing emotional granularity and for working with difficult emotions in ways that build resilience rather than requiring numbing or suppression.
One of the most damaging modern myths about emotions is that we can simply choose not to feel them without consequence. Many people have been taught, either explicitly or implicitly, that difficult emotions should be pushed down, ignored, or overcome through willpower. While this approach may create short-term functionality, it creates significant long-term problems for nervous system health. When emotions are suppressed, the nervous system does not simply stop processing them. Instead, it holds the unprocessed emotional energy in the body, often as chronic tension, digestive issues, sleep disturbances, or a general sense of unease. Over time, this suppressed emotional material accumulates and makes the nervous system more reactive and less resilient. Ancient traditions understood that emotions are meant to move through the body and be expressed or released in healthy ways. Suppressing them interferes with this natural process and creates dysregulation rather than the calm that suppression is often intended to achieve. Modern neuroscience has begun to confirm what ancient traditions observed. The suppression of emotional expression has measurable physiological costs. When we inhibit the natural expression of emotion, we increase sympathetic activation and reduce vagal tone. This means that the very act of trying not to feel something often creates more nervous system stress than simply allowing the emotion to be felt and expressed appropriately. Additionally, suppressed emotions tend to leak out in indirect ways through irritability, passive-aggressive behavior, sudden emotional outbursts, or physical symptoms. The nervous system finds a way to express what has been suppressed, but often in ways that create more problems than the original emotion would have. This is why many people who pride themselves on being emotionally strong or not emotional often experience sudden breakdowns or chronic health issues later in life. The suppressed material eventually demands attention. Another consequence of emotional suppression is the loss of emotional intelligence and self-trust. When we consistently override our emotional responses, we gradually lose the ability to accurately read our own inner state. We may no longer know what we actually feel or need because we have trained ourselves to ignore internal signals. This creates a profound disconnection from the body's wisdom and makes it much harder to make decisions that are aligned with our true needs and values. Ancient traditions understood that emotions carry important information about our environment, our relationships, and our inner state. Suppressing them is not just physiologically costly, it is also informationally costly. We lose access to a vital source of guidance about how to navigate our lives wisely. One of the most powerful and counterintuitive practices from Stoic philosophy is negative visualization, or premeditatio malorum, the practice of deliberately imagining worst-case scenarios in order to reduce anxiety and build resilience. At first glance, this practice seems like it would increase anxiety rather than reduce it. However, when practiced skillfully, negative visualization actually decreases the nervous system's chronic low-level fear response by reducing the fear of uncertainty itself. Modern anxiety is often driven not by actual present threats, but by the fear of what might happen in the future. By deliberately and calmly contemplating worst-case scenarios, we rob them of their power to create background anxiety. The nervous system learns that even the worst outcomes are survivable, which reduces the constant scanning for potential threats that characterizes modern anxiety. In this chapter, we explore how to practice negative visualization in a way that builds resilience rather than increasing fear. The key to effective negative visualization is approaching it from a regulated state rather than from a state of anxiety. The practice is not about catastrophizing or dwelling on worst-case scenarios in a fearful way. It is about calmly and clearly considering what the worst realistic outcome might be, and then considering how we would respond if it actually happened.
This process often reveals that even genuinely difficult outcomes would be survivable, and that we would have more resources and options than our anxious mind believes. The nervous system receives a powerful message: even if the worst happens, I can handle it. This message reduces the background hum of anticipatory anxiety that many people carry constantly. Ancient Stoics practiced this not to become pessimistic, but to become free from the fear of uncertainty that limits so many lives. Modern research on worry and anxiety has found results consistent with Stoic observations. People who engage in deliberate, structured worry or negative visualization for a limited time often experience less background anxiety throughout the day than people who try to suppress worry or distract themselves from it. The practice seems to give the nervous system a sense of control and preparedness that reduces the need for constant hypervigilance. However, it is important to distinguish between healthy negative visualization and anxious rumination. The Stoic practice is done from a place of calm curiosity and is time-limited. Anxious rumination is involuntary, repetitive, and tends to increase activation rather than reduce it. Learning to practice negative visualization skillfully requires some nervous system regulation to begin with, which is why it fits well within a broader practice of emotional regulation and inner strength development. Let's now explore additional practices for working with anxiety and difficult emotions in ways that build rather than deplete our inner resources.
Even with the best regulation practices, emotional storms will still arise. Life will continue to present situations that trigger anger, grief, fear, shame, or overwhelm. The question is not how to prevent all emotional activation, but how to return to calm more quickly and completely after activation occurs. This capacity to recover is one of the most important markers of nervous system health and emotional resilience. Many people remain in activated or shut down states for hours, days, or even longer after an emotional trigger because they lack effective recovery practices. Ancient traditions developed sophisticated methods for returning to baseline after emotional intensity. These methods were not about forcing calm or pretending the emotion didn't happen. They were about supporting the nervous system in completing its natural cycle of activation and return to safety. In this chapter, we explore practical approaches to emotional recovery that actually work with the nervous system rather than against it. One of the most important principles of emotional recovery is allowing the nervous system to complete its response rather than interrupting it. When we experience an emotional trigger, the nervous system often initiates a full protective response: increased heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension, and narrowed attention. If we immediately try to suppress or distract from this response, the nervous system may interpret this as further evidence of threat, which prolongs activation. Allowing the response to move through by breathing, moving the body, or expressing emotion safely helps the nervous system register that the threat has passed and that it is safe to return to baseline. This is why practices like shaking, vocalizing, or physical movement can be surprisingly effective after emotional intensity. They give the nervous system a way to discharge the activation that was mobilized. Another key element of recovery is creating conditions of safety after the storm has passed. This includes physical safety, a quiet space, comfortable position; social safety, the presence of a calm person or even the memory of one; and internal safety, self-compassionate language, slow breathing, grounding. The nervous system is highly responsive to cues of safety, and deliberately creating these cues after emotional activation helps accelerate the return to calm. Many people make the mistake of trying to return to normal activities immediately after an emotional storm, which can interrupt the recovery process. Taking even 10 or 15 minutes to consciously support the nervous system in settling can make a significant difference in how completely and quickly we recover. Ancient traditions often built recovery time into daily rhythms through practices like meditation, prayer, or simply sitting in silence after difficult experiences. Modern life rarely provides this recovery time automatically, which is why we need to create it intentionally. One of the most common modern approaches to personal development is attempting to build discipline and strength through increased motivation. We try to feel more motivated, more inspired, or more determined in order to follow through on our intentions. This approach has a fundamental flaw. Motivation is inherently unreliable and fluctuates based on our nervous system state, sleep, hormones, and countless other factors outside our control. Ancient traditions understood that true inner strength cannot depend on something as unstable as motivation.
Instead, they focused on building character, habits, and inner resources that remain available even when motivation is low or absent. This is a fundamentally different approach to building strength, one that is more sustainable and less vulnerable to the ups and downs of emotional and physiological states. In this chapter, we explore how to build inner strength that does not require constant motivation to maintain. The Stoics made a clear distinction between what they called externals and what they called the ruling faculty, or inner citadel. Externals included everything outside our control, including our emotional states and level of motivation. The ruling faculty was our capacity to choose our response regardless of how we felt. They believed the true strength came from developing this inner capacity rather than trying to control or optimize our emotional state. This perspective is profoundly relevant to modern struggles with discipline and consistency. When we try to build habits or follow through on intentions by first trying to feel motivated, we are building on an unstable foundation. When we instead focus on developing the capacity to act in alignment with our values, even when we don't feel like it, we build something much more reliable. This does not mean forcing ourselves through sheer willpower. It means developing practices and perspectives that make aligned action more accessible even in the absence of motivation. One practical way to build this kind of strength is through small, consistent actions that are taken regardless of emotional state. Ancient traditions often emphasize the importance of daily practices performed whether one felt like doing them or not. The consistency itself becomes a form of training for the nervous system and the will. Over time, the nervous system learns that action does not depend on feeling a certain way, which reduces the power of fluctuating motivation. Another important element is developing self-respect that is not dependent on emotional states or external outcomes. When our sense of worth is tied to how we feel or what we accomplish on any given day, we become vulnerable to the inevitable fluctuations of motivation and emotion. Ancient traditions cultivated a sense of dignity and self-respect that was more stable and less dependent on momentary states. This inner foundation makes it easier to act in alignment with our values, even when motivation is low.
The distinction between reacting and responding is one of the most practically useful concepts in emotional regulation. A reaction is an automatic, often unconscious response driven by the nervous system's protective mechanisms. A response is a chosen action that takes into account the full context and our values. The space between reaction and response is where our freedom and power lie. In modern life, many people have very little space between stimulus and response. Emotional triggers immediately produce reactive behavior, snapping at loved ones, sending impulsive messages, making decisions from fear or anger, or shutting down. Ancient traditions recognized that this reactivity is not an inevitable feature of human nature, but a consequence of insufficient inner development. They developed practices specifically designed to create more space between what happens and how we respond to it. In this chapter, we explore how to cultivate this space and why it is so valuable for both nervous system health and quality of life. Creating space between reaction and response requires some degree of nervous system regulation. When we are highly activated or shut down, our capacity for conscious choice is significantly reduced. The thinking brain goes offline, and the protective survival mechanisms take over. This is why attempts to not react often fail when we are in a dysregulated state. The nervous system has already initiated a protective response before conscious awareness catches up. This is also why regulation practices, such as slow breathing, grounding, or taking a short walk, are so effective at creating space. They help bring the nervous system back into a state where conscious choice becomes possible again. Ancient traditions understood this connection between regulation and freedom of response. Practices like meditation, breathwork, and physical disciplines were not just about feeling calm, they were about developing the capacity to respond to life from a place of choice rather than automatic reaction. Another important factor in creating space is developing the habit of pausing before responding. Many reactive patterns happen so quickly that we are not even aware we had a choice. Simply inserting a deliberate pause, even a few seconds, can interrupt the automatic reaction and create room for a more considered response. This pause can be supported by physical practices, taking a breath, changing posture, stepping outside, or by mental practices, asking, "What would the wisest version of me do here?" or simply naming what we are feeling. Over time, this pausing becomes more automatic, and the space between reaction and response grows larger. This does not mean we never react strongly. It means we have more choice about when and how we react, and we are less likely to do things we later regret. One of the most valuable capacities we can develop is the ability to hold space for difficult emotions, both in ourselves and in others, without immediately trying to fix, change, or escape them. This capacity is often called holding space in modern therapeutic contexts, but ancient traditions have their own versions of this practice. They recognize that difficult emotions often need to be witnessed and allowed before they can transform or release. When we immediately try to fix or suppress difficult feelings, we often interfere with the natural processing that the nervous system needs to do. Ancient wisdom traditions developed sophisticated approaches to being with suffering, both one's own and others, that did not require changing the emotion, but rather changing our relationship to it. In this chapter, we explore how to cultivate the capacity to hold space for difficult emotions in a way that supports regulation and eventual integration. The Stoic practice of sympathia, the recognition of our interconnectedness with all beings, included the capacity to be present with others' suffering without being overwhelmed by it or needing to immediately fix it. This required a regulated nervous system capable of staying present with intensity without becoming activated or shut down. Similarly, Buddhist practices of compassion involve being present with suffering while maintaining enough equanimity that we do not become lost in it or try to escape it. These practices were not about becoming cold or detached. They were about developing enough internal stability that we could remain present with what is difficult without adding our own reactivity to it. This same capacity applies to our own difficult emotions. When we can hold space for our own anger, grief, fear, or shame without immediately judging it or trying to make it go away, the emotion often moves through more quickly and completely. Modern neuroscience supports the value of this approach. When we allow emotions to be felt and expressed in a safe, witnessed context, whether with another person or with ourselves through self-compassion, the nervous system is better able to process and integrate the emotional experience. When we suppress, judge, or immediately try to change difficult emotions, the nervous system often holds on to them longer because the processing has been interrupted. This is why practices like journaling, talking with a trusted person, or simply sitting with an emotion while breathing slowly can be so effective. They create the conditions for the nervous system to do what it naturally knows how to do: process and release. Ancient traditions understood this deeply and built practices and community structures that supported this kind of emotional holding and processing. In modern life, we often need to create these conditions more intentionally. Let's now explore what it means to become someone who can stay steady with both our own and others' difficult emotions over the long term.
The ultimate goal of emotional regulation and inner strength development is not to eliminate difficult experiences or emotions. It is to become someone who can stay steady, wise, and compassionate even when life is hard. This is a fundamentally different orientation than trying to optimize our emotional state or avoid discomfort. Ancient traditions understood that life will inevitably bring loss, conflict, uncertainty, and pain. The question is not how to avoid these experiences, but who we become in response to them. Do we become more reactive, more shut down, more bitter? Or do we become more steady, more compassionate, more wise? This question points to the deepest purpose of the practices explored in this pillar. They are not just techniques for feeling better. They are practices for becoming a particular kind of person, someone who can hold space for the full range of human experience without losing their center. In this final chapter, we reflect on what it means to walk this path over a lifetime. Becoming someone who can stay steady when things get hard requires a long-term perspective. It is not about perfect regulation in every moment. It is about a gradual, consistent development of capacity over years and decades. Every time we choose to stay present with a difficult emotion rather than suppress it, we strengthen the neural pathways that support regulation. Every time we pause before reacting and choose a more considered response, we build the muscle of inner freedom. Every time we extend compassion to ourselves or others in the midst of suffering, we develop the heart's capacity to remain open. These small, repeated choices compound over time into a fundamentally different way of being. Ancient traditions recognized this long-term nature of inner development. They did not promise quick fixes or permanent states of calm. They offered practices and perspectives that, when engaged consistently over a lifetime, gradually transform who we are and how we meet whatever life brings. This long-term perspective is both humbling and liberating. It frees us from the pressure to be perfectly regulated or constantly calm. It also invites us to take responsibility for our own development rather than waiting for circumstances to change. The practices explored in this pillar, understanding why emotions feel overwhelming, learning to feel without being controlled by feelings, building resilience without numbing, working with rather than against the nervous system, and developing the capacity to hold space for difficulty are not destinations, they are ongoing practices that deepen over time. As we continue to engage them, we gradually become people who can stay steady, not because life has become easy, but because we have developed the inner resources to meet it wisely. This is perhaps the greatest gift of ancient wisdom applied to modern nervous system challenges, not the promise of a life without difficulty, but the possibility of becoming someone who can meet difficulty with grace, wisdom, and an open heart. Thank you for exploring this pillar with me. If these perspectives and practices have been meaningful, I encourage you to return to them regularly and to be patient with yourself as you develop these capacities over time. The path of emotional regulation and inner strength is not always easy, but it is deeply worthwhile. I'll see you in the next pillar.